I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views.
Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. Independent media matters, and your support makes it possible. If Parallax Views has challenged your thinking, exposed you to new ideas, or simply kept you company on your commute, now's the time to help sustain it. Listen, share, and if you can, support the show on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. If you want, you can also make a one-time donation by contacting me at parallaxviewspod@protonmail.com. I can give you a link to my PayPal page if you contact me that way. Let's show what listener-supported media can do. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. On this edition of the program, we'll be hearing from journalist and author Ross Halperin about his new book, Bear Witness: The Pursuit of Justice in a Violent Land. Halperin takes us deep into the Honduran barrio, where poverty and gang violence create a landscape of fear and impunity. At the heart of his narrative are Kurt Ver Beek and Carlos Hernández, who together founded the Association for a More Just Society. Rejecting traditional models of charity, they pursued justice through daring, sometimes clandestine methods, taking on gangs, corrupt officials, and a failing state. I also want to note that I'm bringing back an old sponsor to the show, Mike Swanson of Wall Street Window, whose work you can find at wallstreetwindow.com. There you can find his book, The Twofold Formula, the single best trading pattern that I have ever used. It's a free ebook, and you can subscribe to his newsletter as well. I highly recommend it. Mike is someone who will give you the financial news and trading news straight, and I've always relied on him for that. So if you can, head over to wallstreetwindow.com. Also, be sure to try and support me on Patreon if you can. I've tried the show without sponsors, but it's been a bit difficult, and I understand that many cannot afford to support the Patreon. But if you can, please consider supporting it. I could really use that help. With that being said, let's get right to the conversation with Ross Halperin. Welcome to Parallax Views, a guest that I'm very happy to have on. I'm currently reading through his latest book, which is going to be the topic of our conversation. I'm speaking with Ross Halperin, a journalist who has been reporting on things that are happening in Honduras. He spent time there, and he has a new book out about his time in Honduras and the story he's been covering involving two very interesting men that we're going to get into. The book is called Bear Witness, and it's, I'm just starting it, to be honest, because I only received my copy this weekend, but it's a bit of a thriller, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, it sure is. It's there's twists and turns. There's some pretty scary people. There's some pretty amazing acts of heroism. That was the reaction I had when I first heard Kurt Ver Beek, the subject of his book, like talk about his life in a pretty mundane way. I was like, wow, like this sounds like as a recipe of a thriller book.
Yeah, I should mention the subtitle, which I didn't mention before, The Pursuit of Justice in a Violent Land. That title really sticks out, caught my eye, especially when your publicist got me in contact with you. I'm like, wow, what is this about? So maybe we can get into it. But first, how did this book come about? I believe it was a result of a criminologist by the name of David M. Kennedy. That's sort of the origins of the book.
That's right. Yeah, Kennedy's a super interesting guy. He's a criminologist at John Jay in New York, but he's really way more than an academic. I mean, he's someone who for the past 30 years has developed and refined this methodology for going into some of the most violent neighborhoods in the United States and working with police and prosecutors and the community to drastically reduce gun violence. And he has an amazing track record of doing that. There's actually a really cool New Yorker article about him that people can read if they're interested. But anyways, back in 2017, he got really interested in the problem of impunity. And I was kind of like a researcher working for his friend, and he hired me to help him look into that. And, this might surprise some of your listeners, but like, whereas in other comparable wealthy democracies in like Asia and Europe, like upwards of 90% of homicides are solved. In the US at that time, and still only two-thirds are, like 60% of homicides are solved. And it's very skewed. So if you look at places like Chicago, it's maybe 25% of homicides are solved. And actually, it's even more disturbing than that because the vast majority of shootings in this country are non-fatal, and the solve rate for those is atrocious. So we
I
were
was gonna
studying
say,
that.
wasn't there another book that covered this that was also influential for you guys? Ghetto Side.
That's it. That's it. That's it. Yeah. So ghetto side is what sparked both of our curiosity in this, both of our feelings that something needed to be done. And Jill Leovi, the writer of that book, it's an amazing book about this issue, and it still holds up today and is worth reading, and all the same issues are still true. But she was someone who I really got to know during that research process, and as someone who's become a friend and a mentor, and really is the one who encouraged me to write this book. But that book is sort of the magnus opus of American impunity. But anyways, so we were thinking about what to do about the problem, and then Kennedy organized this like symposium in New York City, which Jill Leovi attended. The New York City chief detectives attended, an academic with an expertise in ballistics attended, and then one of the people who dialed in, he couldn't come up from Honduras, was Kurt Ver Beek, and he ended up being the subject of my book. And he had developed, along with his partner, this program for reducing impunity, for basically solving the problem we were hoping to address. And, it was one of those moments where I just like felt my life change because it was like, wow, these people might have figured something out in a place where violence and impunity are even worse than in Chicago. And I was just so fascinated in him, his life, his decisions, the risks he had taken, the philosophies he lived by. It was so unusual and striking, and I was captivated.
So let's get into these two main characters that form the basis of the book. They're sort of the centerpiece of it. You already mentioned one, Kurt Ver Beek, who is an American sociologist, and the other is Carlos Hernández, a Honduran school teacher. Do you want to start with telling my audience a little bit more about Kurt, and then you can tell my audience about Carlos?
Sure. So Kirk grew up in this suburban Chicago town called South Holland. Now, it's an unusual Chicago suburb because it's very religious and it feels almost rural. And he was part of the Dutch Midwestern culture, so part of the Calvin Christian Reformed Church, which is Calvinist, very religious guy from a young age. Went to Calvin University, which is a Protestant college in Western Michigan, met his wife there, who's from the area. And right after college, they decide, like, we want to help the poor. And they get a job in Costa Rica. Then they get transferred to Honduras pretty soon thereafter. And, like, look, there's a lot of young, idealistic people who kind of do stuff like that, but most of them are only somewhat committed. But these people are different. This is a very different couple. They are wholeheartedly committed to this mission of helping the poor. And the first moment, one of the first moments where you really get a sense that they're different is they decide to move at this point with their two kids to Nueva Suyapa, which is one of the poorest and most dangerous neighborhoods in all of Honduras. And that's a very radical and unusual and controversial thing for this little gringo family to be doing. And it's there really that Kurt forges this best friendship with his next door neighbor, Carlos Hernandez. Now, Carlos grew up in rural Honduras, kind of near the Caribbean coastline. bouncing around different, uncles and grandmas and grandpas in order to be within walking distance of a school that educated kids his age. And, he moved to Tegucigalpa, the capital, on kind of a whim, no job, no place to stay, no money, and builds a little life for himself working for evangelical charities. And, he's very much part of his church. That's his social life, that's his community. But he very quickly develops this sense of rebellion against what he sees as the evangelical church's overemphasis on things like praying and converting and the afterlife. What's going to happen to us in the afterlife? Are we going to heaven or hell? And he thinks that's at the expense of helping in the here and now. And he wants to help in the here and now in addition to all the other stuff. So he decides to open up a school in the most needy, marginalized neighborhood in Tegucigalpa, which is once again Nueva Suyapa. So he builds this amazing school. There's a health clinic, there's a micro lender, and him and Kurt spend their first 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years in Nueva Suyapa doing all the normal things that humanitarians and missionaries do to help the poor to a very extreme and admirable degree. But then there's a point, and this is really where the book starts, where they say, nah, like we're going to do things a little differently.
I want to get into that, but first, can you paint a sort of picture for my audience of what life in the barrios is like?
Yeah, so like a lot of Latin American cities, Tegucigalpa, it's the capital, it's 1 million people. It has this like urban core, which is where there's malls and fast food restaurants and government buildings and taxis and buses and all that stuff. And it's, very concrete and pretty low buildings, but there's some bigger ones. But then encircling that core are these mountainsides, and on them are built these barrios, and they're informal. And Nueva Suyapa is a larger one. It's one of the more notable ones. And just to give like there's dirt roads, there's little paths. I mean, there's some houses which are at this point quite nice, but there's some which are, built in the most ramshackle fashion you could imagine with like signage, wood, car tires, anything someone can build with. I mean, just to give you one example of what life is like there are water pipes by the time the book starts, but and this is a community of 25, 30,000 people. The water system is so poorly designed and insufficient that water only shows up at each household 1 day per month. So on that 1 day when water arrives at your house, you have to spend hours collecting as much of it as you possibly can into buckets and barrels and tanks. And that's the water you have for the rest of the month. And by the way, it's not like clockwork like a month. It's like roughly a month. So it could be a little more, it could be a little less, and it's a very difficult thing to deal with. And then the other salient thing is violence. So, your listeners might be familiar with a gang which is still very much in the news called MS-13. They have a rival called Barrio 18. These were two gangs that were founded in Los Angeles in the 80s and essentially exported to Central America. But as of 2005, when the book starts, one or both of those gangs is essentially in control of all of the barrios in Tegucigalpa. And Nueva Suyapa was originally kind of a Barrio 18 neighborhood, but this offshoot of the Barrio 18 called the Puchos takes over. And, these gangs, including the Puchos, they're doing all the things that you would expect. So murder, um, assault, robbery, extortion, a lot of violence. And, this is a country which I think in the 3 years leading up to the start of the book had either the highest, second highest, or third highest homicide rate in the world. And it's not just violence, it's violence coupled with impunity. So the Honduran justice system was so broken, so corrupt, so inept that there was very little justice happening. And these gangs were getting away with a lot. And people were fed up, people were frustrated, people were getting hurt, people were getting killed. And that is really what propelled Kurt and Carlos into action. They said, enough. We need to stop this if no one else will.
I want to get into more of what Kurt and Carlos did, but one aspect of the story that I found interesting is there's this construction of a dam or the Honduras Power Authority concludes that they really need to build this dam, that it's worth doing, and it sort of lingers over the story or hovers over it in some ways. Can you speak to why that is? Maybe because I don't want to give everything away, but it's an important part of the story.
So you have read a good amount of it then. That's like almost midway through the book. Um, yeah, so that's one of my favorite parts of the book, and like, it's really a tangent from the main story. Like most of the book, it's kind of written to be very tight around the storyline and the characters. But I came across this just incredible story about the construction of a dam in Honduras, and yeah, I don't know how much I want to give away about it because believe it or not, it actually is quite a thrilling story. But essentially, it's a story about in the 60s and 70s. Honduras had very little power. Most of the population wasn't connected to the grid to the extent it was producing electricity. It might have been like charcoal and diesel, very, very archaic ways of doing it. And the military rulers of the country and people at the World Bank and the IDB basically came up with this plan to build one of the largest and most high-tech dams in the world in Honduras. And these engineering projects are just incredible. Like just the boldness of stopping a river and building a reservoir and creating power out of it are incredible. And the idea of doing it in the middle of nowhere in a poor country is even more ambitious and wild. And they build it, and as you know, there's immediately lots of problems. And ranging from leaks through the foundation to the reservoir shrinking because there's not enough rainfall happening in the catchment area. And just this process of trying to fix it is really a thriller in and of itself. And you're wrestling with nature, you're wrestling with engineering, and the stakes are enormous because at that point, fast forward through the construction and like the early attempts to solve these problems, the country's dependent on this thing. And if like as it's starting to fail, people are dealing with, 1 hour outages and then 2 hour outages, then 5 hour outages. And then it's almost like, is it going to go to 12 hours? And then if this dam fails, um, how much of the country won't have power and for how long? This is not easy infrastructure to build. And then, sort of the really climactic moment in that story is Hurricane Mitch. And this was a huge hurricane. I think it's one of the biggest hurricanes in recorded history. Smashes into Honduras and the dams above Tegucigalpa, which is not the dam I write about, but they overflow. And these huge, like bomb-like waves smash down into the city and cleave entire neighborhoods into oblivion, killing so many people, ripping off bridges, throwing bridges through neighborhoods. It's just horrible tragedy. And Cajon is at risk of suffering something similar. And I guess I won't say what happens, but that's sort of the final dramatic moment in that story. And yeah, I'm happy to hear you latched onto that because that was
Well,
one part I really enjoyed myself.
without giving away the ending of that portion of the story or that sort of the side story within the bigger story, why did you feel the need to include that as a sort of side story to all of this? What's the significance of it if you were to tie it together?
Look, I think one of the themes in the book, and it comes up over and over again, is like the collision of good intentions, especially good intentions coming from humanitarians in other countries or like big NGOs or big,
Ivory Tower academics, yeah.
yeah, like you have these ideas and these philosophies, and then you bring them to this country, which you're not so familiar with, and like it's just different in a lot of ways and is more difficult to do these things. And it's not, Kansas. Um,
It's not
and
the
I think
same as living it. And I think people like Carlos understand that.
exactly. And I think there's so much humanitarianism and missionary work that does come from that top-down approach of like helicoptering in, we've got the idea, we'll implement it. And Kurt and Carlos from the beginning are very much in rebellion against that. Kurt especially because he's the gringo. He's like, I don't want to be like the other gringos who've just popped down here with my ideas. I want to come down here and live here and experience it and kind of become in a way Honduran myself before I even dare to say this is what should be done here. And the book starts at a point where he and Carlos are making this very decisive and bold statement about what should happen. But at that point, Kurt had been living in Honduras for over 15 years and really immersed himself in it, got a PhD, studied it, worked there. And, we're talking about this huge $750 million dam, which back then was a lot more money. But I mean, Kurt's even very critical of, for example, something that was big fad back at the time when the book started, which was like the student and missionary groups. They come down to Honduras and they build a house. They're there for 2 weeks. Um, he very much sees himself in opposition to that. So I think you're right. It is a metaphor for a lot of what else is in the book.
What do you think it is about Kurt? Because I found that very interesting. Because I think most of us, when we hear like Christian missionary, we have certain ideas. A lot of times, there's a lot of criticism of Christian missionaries, especially from more secular minded people. Uh, what sets sort of Kurt apart? Because he does seem like a breed apart from a lot of other missionaries. Whether we want to be, I'm not trying to be like too critical of Christian missionaries, but he does seem like a different breed in a way.
He's a very idiosyncratic guy. I mean, you meet him and you see him, he doesn't look idiosyncratic in a lot of ways or sound idiosyncratic, but he really is. And like, I mean, it starts with his interpretation of like Christian theology before we even get into like some of the practical things. I mean, he studied with a theologian at Calvin University where he went, and I'm happy to go into more detail if you like, but like the summary is most people read the New Testament, or what they think of the New Testament is it's really about these sort of soft qualities like forgiveness and grace. And like, if you're victimized, what you're supposed to do is turn your cheek and love your enemy. He interprets scripture differently, and he thinks the New Testament is actually much more about justice than people realize. And in part, that has to do with the mistranslation of a Greek word. And so that's where it begins for him. He sees the New Testament and what it says as a call for justice, and not like justice in the vague sense of the word that we sometimes all use, but justice as literally like the administration of law.
Can you go a little bit deeper into that? Because I think my listeners would be interested in like the sort of theological background that Kurt has, or like how theology influences the work he's doing.
Yeah, so I guess I'll just talk about that like linguistic thing a little bit because it's super interesting. Like, so the Old Testament was originally written in Hebrew and Aramaic, and the New Testament was originally written in Greek. And we all know, like Old Testament, there's all sorts of like eye for an eye, justice, harsh stuff. And in the New Testament, it feels much more about grace and love and forgiveness. But this theologian that Kurt studied with at Calvin, so there's this Greek words dikaios and dikaiosune, and they appear hundreds of times in the New Testament. And in most English translations of the Bible, they're typically translated to righteous and righteousness. At the time the scripture was written, however, those words could also mean just and justice. And actually, in stuff like Aristotle and Plato's works, that's usually how they're translated. So essentially, like this professor went through all of those translations on a case by case basis and found that in a lot of cases, justice was the more appropriate translation. So, like, even in something like the Sermon on the Mount, there's the traditional translation, but in this different contrarian translation, you have Jesus saying, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for justice." And Kurt is really someone who, like, sincerely does look to scripture to inform what he does in life. So that's the starting point. And then I think it's like, look, it's just he's a very studious person. He's a very open-minded person. And he allowed the reality on the ground in Honduras to inform him. So, like, he did do the traditional NGO package, helping with the water, helping with the land titling, like education, like all of that stuff. But because he was living in Nueva Suyapa, because Carlos was living in Nueva Suyapa, which the other NGO humanitarian people were not. They and actually really more Carlos because he was running the school got to just see firsthand how much violence impeded the other stuff, the education, the micro lending,
Can
the
you give
land
any
titling.
specific examples?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many. I think just like, the most obvious one is the extortion thing. It's like if you open a business in Nueva Suyapa, you're going to have to pay extortion to a gang. it's a bus company, it's a taxi company, it's a little bodega, and you have, I mean, you're struggling to get by as is. And then imagine having to pay a fixed sum of money every week. It's not a percentage of your sales, it's a fixed sum of money, whether you have to take care of your grandma or not. Imagine what that does to your business. And then imagine how many people don't even bother starting businesses in the first place because they don't want to deal with this because it's dangerous. And yeah, there is examples. There's this, story of this great family who like starts from nothing. They build this incredible bodega, bigger and bigger. They're getting loans from Carlos's micro lender, expanding their inventory, expanding their space, adding up, grocery items, like real entrepreneurship, the type of stuff anyone wants to see. Their kids are in school, they're doing well, and then just one day out of nowhere, they disappear. They move out to the countryside, and they won't really explain why, but reading between the lines, it's like something must have happened, with extortion and or whatnot. So there's that, and then there's just I don't know. Yeah, I think that's one good example.
So a lot of this story, it feels like it's a story that is of two men who I don't want to say they started out as idealists necessarily, but maybe that there's like a turn towards like, well, the approach that other NGOs are taking is too idealistic and we need to be more pragmatic. What's the turning point there?
Man, I think it's just like you have to understand. I mean, when you're living in this neighborhood, you know people who've been murdered. You've seen it firsthand. And Carlos, especially, like he runs this school, which is such an important institution in the community. He's almost like the mayor, the unofficial mayor of Nueva Suyapa. So like when people have problems, they come to him. It doesn't matter if it's day or night or middle of the fucking, middle of the night, whatever it is, they come to him. And he's just like here's this tragic and terrible example of what I think really changed him is like ambulances won't go to Nueva Suyapa at night. It's dangerous, they're not available, and most people don't have cars, and the taxis and buses aren't working at night. So like if someone got shot, their relatives would probably knock on Carlos's door and he would have to go and pick up the body, put him in his car and drive him to the hospital. And there was this pure burst of violence, this period where all these kids who he knew who were part of his programs and maybe were a little bit involved in gang life were getting shot. And he would have to go pick up these kids who were bleeding from bullet holes, put them in his car, drive them to the hospital, and then find out that they were already dead, or maybe they died there. And I think having those experiences firsthand, like, I don't want to say toughens you or like steals you, but I think it definitely reorients your mindset. It's like we can't afford to be purely idealists. We have to be people who actually get stuff done and change the situation. And, as you know, like what pragmatism ends up meaning is that like you have to make compromises and you have to do things that are contrary to your ideals. And they do that.
Yeah, one of the areas I wanted to talk about with regards to that was the sort of lines that blur between vigilantism and uh, well, just how does vigilantism sort of figure into the story?
Yeah. So as you know, it has a big role in the story and it has a big role in Honduras, frankly. And, we're describing situations where there's a lot of violence and there's a lot of lawlessness. And the standard response to that all across the world, all across time is vigilantism. So the people who say, we need to stop this, say, we're going to get guns and we're going to go shoot these kids ourselves. And a lot of that goes on in Nueva Suyapa. There's all sorts of different iterations of it. There are sort of the like reluctant watchmen who are like, we're going to stand on our street corner at night with guns, and if anyone comes, we'll react. But like, we really don't want to kill people, and like, we're just doing this because we have to. There's like the people who almost seem like they're homicidal psychopaths who use this as a almost pretext to like go out and kill in a way that like has some tacit support of the community. But like, and there's a character in this book, as you know, who does that. And like, he does fashion himself as this justice serving hero, but it becomes pretty clear quickly that he just enjoys murdering teenage boys with like a real flair and gusto to it. And then there's the cops. I mean, look, there's all sorts of flavors of police corruption, but there's to some extent there are these clandestine units of the police who at night are going into these neighborhoods and killing gang members or alleged gang members. And it's hard to know how much of that really went on, but some of it definitely did. And the last thing I want to say on that is Kurt and Carlos are as against that stuff as they are against gang violence. And they see it as just almost another version of it. So they're trying to come up with a solution that allows them as citizens to do something, but is not taking up arms.
I mean, it gets really interesting at a certain point because you have uh, Kurt and Carlos doing work to take on these gangs, these Mara gangs, right? And it's interesting because they've often mentored these boys who they are then as I believe the New York Times put it, who are then they're then working to lock up after because some of these kids get involved with these gangs.
Yeah, I mean, that's just one of the tensions that exist here. Like, there's not distance here. Like, it's a small community. Carlos, especially, is super plugged in with the youth of Nueva Suyapa. So he, at one time or another, has like dealt with all of these kids. Some are his students, some went to his camps, some participated in programs. And like, he spent his life doing everything he possibly could to prevent them from joining the gangs. But there's just a point where he says, look, it's time to lay down the law. And like, there have to be arrests. These people have to go to prison. And like, this is a big ethical foundation piece for Kurt and Carlos. But like, as horrific as Honduran prisons are, and these are not like American prisons. I mean, all prisons are terrible, obviously, but this is a different level of terrible in terms of the conditions, the cleanliness, the food, the violence, everything. But their opinion is like, look, these kids, if they don't get sent to prison for some period of time, we know what will happen to them. We've seen it happen over and over again. And the answer is that they are going to be killed either by a rival gang member, by a vigilante, or the police. So, in some sense, as almost unchristian and arguably inhumane as it may feel to send kids, teenage boys, to these horrible prisons, we actually think in some respects we're doing them a favor because they will have some life at some point beyond this. And this is a form of protecting it. And there does come a point in the book where they invest a lot of energy and time in trying to improve the prisons, but that's only to a certain extent.
I hope this isn't a dumb question, but there's a sort of third figure I think who looms over the book, and that's the figure of Juan Orlando Hernandez. Maybe you could talk about who he is. He was the former president of Honduras, but he's sort of central to a lot of this in a weird way. I mean, he's mentioned a great deal in the book, and of course, I think Kurt and Carlos have trouble navigating things because they don't necessarily want to be seen as carrying water for him.
Yeah. So this is a fascinating aspect of the story. And just to like give a little bit of context before I directly answer your question, in the third part of the book, Kurt and Carlos say, we don't want to just work at the community level where we can help tens or hundreds of thousands of people. We want to work at the country level where we can affect millions, help millions of Hondurans. And we want to not just essentially replicate the work of police and prosecutors, because we can only do so much of that. We want to fix the police force, the attorney general's office, and the judiciary. We want to fix those institutions. We want to purge them of corruption. We want to make them work better. We want to get the criminals out of there. And how do you do that? It's different. I mean, the first part of the book, it's all about clandestine, clever, ingenuity. And the second part of the book, it's about political power. And Carlos especially, but also really the charity becomes politically powerful. And, they're meeting with presidents and congressmen and ambassadors. And Carlos becomes a very ever-present talking head in the news and a huge media personality. And they end up pulling off a lot of these amazing goals that they have to improve those institutions at great personal risk to themselves. But how did you acquire that political power? The answer is they sort of, I don't want to say allied, but this guy Juan Orlando Hernandez, who at the time when they started was the president of Congress, so he's the head of Congress, but he's really the most powerful person in the country even at that point.
And
He's very support.
he's sort of seen as a strongman type figure almost.
He is, but I think it's also important to note, like he kind of had this, he almost acted and looked like a businessman, kind of like a globe-trotting businessman, very refined. He was a lawyer. A lot of Honduran politicians kind of more emphasize their rustic routes. He kind of was conversant in a bunch of different topics, very focused on earning goodwill with American politicians. But he was, yeah. Like for example, even from the beginning, like if the Supreme Court did something he didn't like, he would get rid of the Supreme Court, or he would just violate the balance of powers in ways that were either quasi-illegal or just straight up illegal. But he was effective, and he was giving ASJ, which is Kurt and Carlos's charity, a remarkable platform to do these good things they wanted to do. So they were dealing with this tension the whole way along. This guy's doing bad stuff, the Supreme Court, allegations of stealing money from the Social Security system, but he's giving us the power to do the good things that we want to do. And as the book, part three of the book progresses, they get more and more amazing stuff done. And he gets more and more controversial, and more about him comes out. And the culmination of this is allegations of narco trafficking. And it's first his brother, who is arrested and extradited to the United States and convicted. And it's looking more and more as the testimonies come out, like his brother, the president of Honduras now, was involved in his narco trafficking operation. And lo and behold, at the conclusion of his term, he was extradited to the United States and convicted in a New York City courtroom and given a life sentence for conspiracy to commit narco trafficking. And this really tarnished Kurt and Carlos's and ASJ's reputation, really, because they were seen as collaborating with this narco trafficker. They didn't know that, obviously, or weren't involved in that aspect of his activities, but it harmed their reputation for sure.
I should add too, I don't think you just mentioned the name of the organization that Carlos and Kurt run. It's ASJ, or the Association for a More Just Society, right?
Yes.
I also wanted to ask you, you mentioned that the book is sort of broken up into distinctive parts. And I've noticed some people really like the part of the book that deals with being on the ground in the barrio. And then other people may like the sort of in the courts, trying to get political influence type um, aspect of the book. But I feel like some people that like one part don't necessarily like the other. At least that's what I've seen in reviews. What do you make of the reactions to the sort of two distinct flavors that the book deals with?
Yeah, I personally like the structure in the sense that like it almost feels like if you were to correlate it to like the screen, more like a TV show with like three different seasons as opposed to like one movie. It's the same main character, so Kurt and Carlos and like their team. It's
But
the
they're dealing with
same,
like two different
country.
worlds. Yeah.
They're dealing, I mean, they're dealing the arena gets bigger and bigger, and the adversaries get more and more high level, and they get more and more powerful through each of the three. So yeah, I could definitely see how some people who love the first part wouldn't like the third as much, which does become more political. Um, but I don't know. I also just feel like, and I certainly respect that and accept that criticism. But I also think like what I like about it is it like, I think most readers aren't coming to this book because they want to learn about Honduras per se. I think it's really like the momentum of the story and the interestingness of the people. But by bringing people through those different arenas, like you really do get to learn about this country and like how it works at different levels. And like, Honduras is so much in our lives here in the United States in the sense of like the deportation issue and the migration issue. And like, it's a major political problem. It's a major civil rights problem. And like, I think it's pretty rare to get this opportunity to get to know a country. So, Yeah, I accept the criticism, but I think it's also nice just even as a reader, like you can kind of read one part, take a little break, read the second part,
Well, I guess I was
the
more so
payoff.
asking, do you think there's something, what do you think is important about the difference, I guess, between that journey through the barrio versus going into the courts and getting more involved in the political aspects of it?
Well, first of all, I think there's corollaries between them all, right? Like, so that thing we're describing with Juan Orlando, where it's like, we know this guy's kind of problematic, but like we kind of need him to get stuff done, is the exact same thing that happens in the barrio, whether it's with like the police or Cholo to a certain extent.
Yeah, we may
It's
have
that
to work with this
same,
person that has like sort of criminal, side hustles or whatever.
yeah, yeah, that, or even like just totally different value systems than us, or like, so I think that repeats itself over and over again, like in each part of the book. And like I think it's just the natural evolution also like it's their growth like the book is around these two characters and that growth in scope is also like their maturity and like they're taking what they learned on the ground and like like when they start like ASJ is super ragtag like they're constantly running out of money like they are making these decisions which maybe are mistakes or things they find regrettable or like would have done differently but they're learning like they're learning how to run an institution they're learning how to be leaders they're learning how to do fundraising. They're learning how to have impact. And like, they could have just kept doing this community level program, but and also it's like the moment is what's driving them. Like as you know, like or maybe you haven't gotten to this part yet, but like what propels them to go from community level to country level isn't just like their decision. Essentially, what happens is Honduras's homicide rate has tripled in a 7 year span. The president was recently cooed out. The Peace Corps is leaving the country. The 80% of the cocaine that is getting to the United States is stopping in Honduras first. The Maras are running amok. And there's a moment where two very high profile people, in pretty short order, like within the span of a month, it's actually three, are assassinated. And it's pretty clear in all of those instances that the police did it. The police were killing these high profile people. So you have this country which feels like it's almost, I don't want to say apocalyptic, but it's as bad as it can get from a violence perspective. And you have these assassinations which caused the public to be like, oh my God, if the police are killing these people in like the bright lights of everyone can see what's going on here. Like this situation is just so messed up. And they jump on the opportunity. They say, we're going to use the connections we have in this moment to try to fix and reform the police. So it's opportunism.
I'm glad you mentioned that term apocalyptic because I was going to say, I know that people listening, I don't want them to get the wrong impression because I think some people will hear this conversation and think, wow, Honduras just sounds like something out of Mad Max, and they may lose sight of the humanity of the people there. So, how do you toe that line between talking about the problems versus, maintaining the humanity? Because I mean, we see it a lot today. There's a lot of racism towards Latin Americans. So, how can we talk about the real problems that a country like Honduras faces while also not dehumanizing?
Yeah, great thing to say. And like it's very much true. Like even in these super dangerous neighborhoods or these super dangerous times, like most people are going about their day, going to work, worried about the same sort of stuff that you and I are worried about. And it's not this hellscape of like constant terror, that it may appear when I'm just like focusing on all the negative things. And it's definitely a risk when you write a book like this. Like, you know, I lived in the neighborhood. I came to love it. I came to love the country, the food, the people, the culture. I made friends. I learned a lot. I did some fun stuff in my free time. Like, um, it's a great place in a lot of ways. And in the book, I tried to like here and there bring some of that out. Like even in the first chapter, like I describe Holy Week, which is like one of the big annual celebrations and how different people celebrate that. And try to bring up the even the Nueva Suyapa, like despite all of its challenges, Kurt and Carlos love living there. The people who live there love living there. There's an amazing sense of community. It's got a great view of the city. There's like a ton of trees. People really help each other out. It's an awesome place in a lot of ways. Um, and I think that actually would be a fair criticism of the book. I mean, like, the first draft of it was literally twice as long. And like a huge part of what the editor does is basically force you, for good reason, to shrink it and focus it. So you end up tightening things around like the most dramatic moments and stuff. And yeah, I think it could give the wrong impression to a certain extent, but that definitely wasn't my intent. And I hope, and look, they're just like beyond like the day-to-day life there, like there's all sorts of incredible acts of heroism that you see from Hondurans throughout the book, whether it's the witnesses or other people stepping up.
I guess I wanted to ask, before we start closing out, what do you think the biggest misconceptions we have in America about Honduras? What are the biggest misconceptions people may have as to why it faces these problems?
Well, I think a lot of people don't realize or know the extent to which US policy has affected the country over the years. I mean, even just something as simple as the Maras, MS-13 and Barrio 18, which we've talked about already. I think most
This
people
is what
don't.
you're going in the exact direction I wanted to go.
Yeah, and it's like, those were not founded in El Salvador, which is, I think, most people would assume. They were founded in Los Angeles by Salvadoran migrants who were there. And in the mid to late 90s, there was a bipartisan deportation effort where a lot of those gang members were sent. And at this point, it wasn't just Salvadorans, it was Hondurans and Guatemalans too in LA. They were sent back to those countries and that they didn't really have a big gang problem. They had some, but not like there is today until that happened. So, and like, I'm not saying that means that like the politicians who did that like should have known better necessarily, but I'm just illustrating at least like, or maybe they should have known better. And actually, there's this amazing cable between Reagan and the Salvadoran president where they actually kind of acknowledge and talk about the risk of this happening, and it does. Um, but it's just the extent to which decisions here affect things there. Another great one is narco trafficking. So, like back in the day, when cocaine first really became a thing, it would come from Colombia and on boats and planes across the Caribbean Sea. The United States spent billions of dollars on a quasi-military effort walling off that route, intercepting the vessels. And what happened wasn't that cocaine stopped going to the United States or people stopped using cocaine or even that it became more expensive. What happened is the routes just shifted westward and it came to Honduras. It was a very convenient place for planes and boats from Venezuela and Colombia to land, and then it would go overland through the United States. So, just the extent to which our country is intertwined with Honduras and these decisions, and it's not going to go away. I think that it will always kind of be our problem if there's gang violence there, if people aren't living well, whether it's because of migration or because of the yo-yoing of these gangs or whatnot. So I think
Well,
just the extent to
even
which we're kind of in it together, I guess is my point.
I guess I was going to say too, it sounds like the situation of lawlessness in these parts of Honduras that you talk about. I mean, it drives immigration, and it seems like the people that are interested in deportation policy overlook that.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a factor. I think sometimes it can be over exaggerated, the extent to which obviously some people are fleeing like horrible, threatening situations. And like, I do not want to diminish that at all, but it's not everyone. Other people are fleeing for economic reasons. Other people are fleeing because they want to try living in a new place. I mean, there's all a million different reasons why people go. But it's true. Like 100% violence drives migration. I don't think there's any debate about that. And it's not just the people who are explicitly fleeing, like the gang who threatened to kill them. It's like the fact that there's violence inhibits economic opportunity and the development of businesses.
Is
It
that what you
inhibits
meant by
like,
economic reasons, like issues of poverty, or
yeah, I mean, just the amount of the differential in earnings that you can make as a construction worker in the United States versus even like being a fairly you know, well-educated professional in Honduras. It's like it's dramatic. I mean, 15% of the Honduran GDP is remittances. So people can come here and support their families. And I mean, it definitely makes you wonder if there's going to be a lot of deportations or a lot less Hondurans in the United States. Like, how will that affect the economy if 15% of the GDP is remittances?
Last question here. So there's an interesting point that comes up with regards to Kurt. He, I believe, wrote an op-ed entitled "What Chicago Can Learn About Violence from Honduras," or he submitted it to the Chicago Tribune. And I'm curious, does he think that there's ways in which we can learn from what he has done in Honduras and apply those lessons to the US?
Yeah. And I think that, look, the fundamental problem that they solved, which was cases weren't getting closed because witnesses wouldn't testify. And they wouldn't testify because they were afraid of retribution and because they didn't trust the criminal justice system. That was the basis for their program. That's what they solved. And they solved it. They came up with a way to bridge that gap. And that is the exact same problem in the south side of Chicago. That is why the impunity rate, which I described at the beginning of this interview, is so low. So I think the very same principles apply. And I think he would say, and I would agree, that at the very least, like it's worth trying. Like, why can't churches or community organizers or charities here give this a shot? And like, there are some differences. Like, for example, in Honduras, you can disguise witnesses in certain circumstances. You can cloak them. You can hide their name in court records. You can't really do that in the United States. But I also think the level of danger is lower, and there's other options for protecting witnesses more here. So I think, and he thinks, yeah, that it is exportable. And the last thing I'll mention is like they did the first version of this in Nueva Suyapa, where they lived, and like it looks like it was super successful. Like the homicide rate declined very substantially. But after that, there was a formal study. So a bunch of researchers came out, ASJ replicated it in like 5 or 6 other neighborhoods, and the data was really good. They compared it to control groups, and the results were remarkable. So like this was proven to work not just in that one community where they lived, but in 5 or 6 other ones. So there's some evidence base suggesting that this is a good idea.
So I know you don't want to give away the secret of what worked, but because I know you want people to read the book, but maybe you can allude to it a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, basically what they do is solve homicides, and they hire a lawyer and a private eye and a psychologist, and that trio of people solves homicides. And like when we think of solved homicides in popular culture, we think of the wrong things because in reality, what that usually comes down to is just convincing a witness to testify and keeping her alive. And you don't need a badge to do that. So the trio starts finding witnesses, getting informants who could introduce them to more witnesses. And the other thing they do is they gather actionable intelligence about gangs, like where do they live? What are their real names? What crimes did they commit? Where are they going to be at Thursday at 4:30 p.m. so we can bring the cops to arrest them? And then on the flip side, they develop relationships with cops and prosecutors and judges, and they give them the resources, and at times they twist their arm to actually make arrests, make prosecutions, and incarcerate these people. And they're remarkably successful.
What do you hope my listeners get out of this conversation, and how can they purchase the book?
Yeah, look, I think that this is just an amazing example of people who look at a real world, so daunting problem and don't say like, man, this is impossible. They say like, let's figure it out. And they come up with ideas. And it's really, we haven't talked about this explicitly much, but like, it's really just an example of like how brave humans could be and how you can put your life on the line to help and what the results of that are. And it's not just Kurt and Carlos, it's also Cholo and the rest of their staff It's the witnesses and the informants who take part in these processes. Like the capacity that we as humans have to step up and be brave in the name of justice, in the name of helping our community is incredible. And I think this is a story that exemplifies that. As I said before, I think this is a chance to learn about a country which, like, whether we like it or not, is very much intertwined with ours and our decisions. And I think it's a book that has like really interesting ideas for solving this impunity problem in the United States. So those are some of the reasons that
When
people
you
might be
say
interested in.
intertwined, not to interrupt you, when you say intertwined, do you think there needs to be a recognition that, in a way, if Honduras does better, we do better by proxy?
Yeah, and I think that has been the MO of the American government for a very long time. I mean, like the aid apparatus to Central America really started with like FDR, and actually like Nelson Rockefeller, who later became vice president, was his first person in charge of doing that. And it evolved. Kennedy really turbocharged it. Every president since has really tried to some extent. Obama did a huge restructuring of how that was done when the immigration crisis really first broke in 2014. And Trump is now bringing that to an end, or has brought that to an end. And he's saying this is all useless, and these countries are still messed up, and they're not really helping us. But I don't think you can just sort of sweep these problems under the rug. I think they're going to come to our doorstep one way or the other, whether it's through the gangs or migration or these countries getting closer to other allies like China who affect our national security. So I think that intertwinement is there.
Well, hey, thank you again, Ross Halperin, for coming on Parallax Views. And people can get the book at their favorite bookstores or online bookstores, right?
Yeah, I mean it should be as far as I'm aware, it seems to be available in a lot of local bookstores, which are great to support. It's available in Barnes and Nobles all across the country, and then obviously, yeah, Amazon and other online platforms as well. There's an Audible, there's an audiobook, a guy recorded it. He's got a great audiobook voice, which I enjoyed hearing. So there's a few different options.
It's gotten good buzz too. I should have mentioned. I think David Gran gave it very good review.
He did, and he came to a little event I did in my hometown in New York, and we had a great interview. This was a great interview too, by the way. Seriously, I really
Thanks so
appreciate
much.
your questions were super thoughtful.
This edition of Parallax Views brought to you by the $10 and above tier supporters of Parallax Views on Patreon. So, with that in mind, producers credit shoutouts to Galen, Matt, Gunnar, Mark, Simon, Alexander, Catherine, G, Tilo, Emilia, Jeremy, Jeff, WV, John, Bert, Brian, Elliot,
Darko,
Tilo, Luke, Michael, Brace, James, Nick,
Mark M,
Mersham, Galen, Gareth, Arlen, Bo, Christopher, Michael, Gigadelic Media, Will, Chance, Chase,
JC,
Dan, Big Bob, David H, Y. Kellerman, Saded 13, Kathleen, David, Ava, Bob, The West Bank Robbery Podcast, Jamie, Enoch, Gary, Max, Ishtofer, James, Martin, Matthew Ho, Brian, Nobody, Thomas, and Dano. Well, that does it for this edition of Parallax Views. As always, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And with that being said,
until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.